Hey, welcome back to this episode of the Downline podcast, where we want to help Christ followers walk faithfully with Jesus and pour their lives into others. Joined again this week by my good friend and the most popular backup quarterback in Germantown High School history, Mr. Shad Berry. Shad, thanks for being back with us.
Thanks for having me. I think we crushed the first episode.
I thought so. Mostly me. My back's sore from
No, you
carrying
did.
the episode, but I
I
stretched
can
in
get
between.
heavy.
Yeah,
I can get
no
heavy.
worries.
But thanks for helping make it all make sense.
Yeah,
So
no
definitely go
problem.
back and listen to that one.
Hey, let's just jump right in and talk about the idea of vocation. So you teach in the Downline Institute, and I like to highlight that because a lot of our listeners are getting more familiar with Downline, and I just encourage our 9 months training to anyone that you can. I've got people in our church out here going through, and
Yeah.
Shad's one of our teachers every year, and it's a
When
great
I was a
session.
student first, I went through it.
Yeah.
One of the most spiritually transformative things I've ever done. So
That's right.
it definitely was meaningful.
And that was, 19 years ago?
Yep, 2006.
Yeah.
Then my wife went through it in the following year, and then I joined staff 2011. So, yeah, a huge part of my spiritual development, which I'm really grateful for.
I want to take what you usually do in an hour or two in the Institute and condense it down to this podcast episode, which is kind of like high level principles.
Yep.
But just start with, I remember a decade ago, I don't know, 12, 13 years ago, even you and I, you start kind of having these conversations about God and work and trying to help people see that work is pre-fall, work in and of itself has dignity, and ministry has been bifurcated into if you get paid to do it or not. And I think God did a lot of work in your life on just reshaping your understanding of even the idea of vocation. So why don't we start there and start unpacking vocation, how you process work, and then we'll kind of see where it goes.
Yeah, thank you. I fell in love with the subject because of my own crisis of calling. You know, when I left our family business to come work at Downline, people would say, "So you feel called into full-time ministry?" And I remember that question really disturbing me, for lack of a better word. So it was like, what does that mean? Do I have to have a special calling to go work at a nonprofit 501c3 faith-based organization, or can anybody do it? If I say yes, does that mean that what I'd been doing for the last 10 years in our family business was not ministry? It felt like it had been. Is ministry reserved for people paid in the church space or philanthropic charitable organization space? So it really put me down this path of what I have come to organize for myself around this idea of the sacred secular divide and what its impact on church thought, which the Protestant Reformation, this aspect of the Protestant Reformation doesn't really get talked about a ton, but that was a massive push to restore the doctrine of vocation, which had been largely hijacked by paid professionals in the priesthood. So it was basically what had become known as kind of the perfected way of life, the perfected way, or the preferred, or like the preferred way, or, something that was tolerable. And so it was a secondary class kind of piety or position. So that part of the Reformation was to restore the priesthood of all believers and to really bring that back to the culture of the church. So really tearing down the sacred secular divide, restoring the dignity of all work, recovering the doctrine of vocation, and embracing the mantle of stewardship have kind of been the four buckets, if you will, for me, or the four pillars that have helped me think about work. And your point about work being pre-fall, it's like one thing that has become kind of these terms that have kind of gotten conflated now. Of when I say work, we typically think occupation. When I say vocation, we think of occupation. When I say job, we're thinking of occupation. So they've lost a little bit of their nuance. And so part of my journey has been what it means to dismantle that divide, that there's really no separation between the sacred and the secular. There's a force of secularization that the church is called to war against.
Right.
Secularization is the removal of the spiritual from things, making them less meaningful and less spiritual or eternal, when in reality, all things have eternal significance, relational
Sure.
significance. So yeah, that's the outline, if you will, of what I try to develop in terms of my thinking or how I approach it.
Well, and even just to back up so that I don't want to take anything, for granted, though most people probably know what we mean. When we say pre-fall, we're saying in Genesis chapters 1 and 2, we see God make everything and he makes it perfect. And he actually gives Adam and his wife, right, a helpmate in this work. He actually calls them to a task to tend the garden, to be fruitful, to multiply, to reign over the animals. That this idea that humanity is given something to do, and we
Mm-hmm.
know that we can put in the category of work because in Genesis 3, after they sin, God says, well, now your work's going to be frustrated. What you are
Mm-hmm.
already doing now becomes incredibly more complicated. And so God only does things that are perfect. And to install that in the first two chapters of Genesis means work in and of itself had this integrated, deep meaning for God's plan for humanity.
Yeah, and all work is so whether you're so occupation is the work that you trade your time for money. So
Mm,
there's our all of our lives are work. John Stott defined work as the exertion of energy, mental, physical, or both, for the benefit of others and the glory of God. So mankind
mm,
is made to cooperate with God by the exertion of energy, physically, mentally, or both, for the benefit of others and the glory of God. So all work is representative. We see God as a worker. We see him as a creator, as a sustainer, as a redeemer, as a consummator. And so each of us, as members of representatives, members of the kingdom, are expressing that. Some of that work I get compensated for. Now,
yeah.
part of the idolatry in the West is my identity gets so wrapped up. And we talked about this for me in the first podcast, but like, my identity can get so wrapped up in what I do as an occupation that it diminishes the other aspects or expression of
Mm,
work. So really restoring the fact that whenever and I use the illustration to drive the point home, like every action, every work, every act of work that I engage in ultimately has a relational consequence.
mm,
So, like, if I don't clean my gutters and I let weeds grow out of them in my neighborhood, or I don't care for my yard, or I don't clean up for myself, that actually is a laziness or a neglect that relationally impacts other people that may or may not express love and dignity. We had a trash day at our house, and normally they come during the week, and so for me, the trash disappears magically. It's there one day, it's gone the next.
yeah.
For whatever reason, it was on a Saturday, and the sanitation worker came up and took the trash, and I took intention like a great citizen and said, "Thank you so much." As I did that, I looked over at my trash, and it was disgusting. It was gross. It was like untidy, unkept, stuff everywhere. He opened the lid, a piece of glass fell off onto the
Mm,
ground and broke. And I was like, "Please don't touch it. I'm so sorry. Let me get it." So, he was kind, took it all away, left. I went inside and called a family meeting that nobody probably attended. But but I remember it was it impressed me so much. It was like, even that work of preparing my trash and how I organize it has a relational consequence.
mm,
It either communicates dignity and worth to another member of God's creation, or it doesn't. So
yeah.
all of work, you can really, when we talk about environmentalism or just taking care of and being a good steward, I think it's such an important point to recognize that
There was
working
a
is loving.
there was a guy out here in Austin when we let out here the first time named John Harrington, who I spent a lot of time with. He's in his 70s now. And we actually wound up while our house was being built in Austin, 1.0, and we lived with him and his wife, Angela, and he used to always say, your yard and your car are an extension of your testimony. And that always stuck with me.
Yeah.
If you're giving somebody a ride and they open the door and like 8 McDonald's bags fall out and they're having to, it's just everything kind of communicates something uh,
Right.
towards someone else. But go ahead, because you've used some terms, work, job, occupation, and vocation. Why don't you go ahead and draw or go ahead and nuance occupation and vocation for
hmm
everybody?
Yeah, so I want my occupation to serve my vocation. I really view, and Oz Guinness wrote a really good book called The Call. It
Hmm.
was really formative for me. One of the first things I read when I was moving from a family business to Downline, um, of painting this picture that the call of God on our lives is God calling us like a lighthouse to himself for himself and sending us into every nook and cranny of the world. And to your point about the Genesis account, where God says, create and cultivate as you see fit. Like there wasn't a whole lot of like, do it this way, plan it this way, call them these, like there was a ton of freedom that was given. And in essence, I take that as like, as long as it's loving and true and honorable and good, then do it. Every good endeavor. So do it with all your heart. And so we have a ton of freedom. Our vocation invites us to represent or reflect, in my estimation, what the kingdom will look like one day. Like we want to represent our hope, the picture of the future of what we know the world will be like one day when Christ returns, that I get to represent that to the best of my ability and my limited view in an accurate way. And that, so so that's the vocation. But, and even in the Great Commission, it says, as you go. Well, where are we going? We're going to work, we're going to school, we're going to play, we're going to church, we're going in the community, out of the community, we're going home, we're going on vacation, recreation. So again, every scenario in which we find ourselves going anywhere, doing anything, we have the opportunity. Like there's no part-time role for a Christ follower. There's no exemption of
Mm.
like, oh, well, you're on vacation now, so you're no longer a representative of the kingdom. Or, there's no exception like that. So for me, it becomes the vocational call on our lives. Now, I may express that occupationally in the public sector, in
Mm.
the private sector, or the for-profit sector, or nonprofit sector. Any of those sectors, in my occupation, I want my occupation to align up as best as I can with that vocational call. And now, when there's a values break, if the organization I'm a part of does not align, then I've got some decisions to make. Like,
Sure.
can I stay faithful to that calling, or is that part of my ministry to be a light in a dark place? Does that become
Sure.
my mission field? Those all become questions that we start to wrestle with and seek guidance and clarity on.
Did uh did you come to that through? I mean, obviously you mentioned Oz Guinness's book, and I'm sure a lot of personal experience, but was it just kind of trial and error, or the wrestling kind of dark night of the soul type of deal? Like, did you feel so constricted and, like you mentioned, almost troubled by the question of calling that you really
Mm-hmm.
had to go into this, or do you just feel like God and His goodness sort of brought this freedom to you?
Yeah, I think probably all the above. Like I don't, I'm not the most studious person in the world. I'm not super academic. This subject gripped me. I think too because I started talking to all these young adults through Downline, and it seemed like they were having to make this black and white decision: do I go into ministry or do I go make money?
Yeah.
And that conversation came up a lot, as
Which,
if it were
by the way, that's a real question.
yeah.
Okay, that's
That might be the case in some
that's not a
instances.
bad question.
Yeah,
Yes.
that needs to be. You need to consider the cost for sure. But it was this black and white kind of false dichotomy that I think was informed by the sacred secular divide. But I got super interested in the subject, so I got introduced to a few resources. The Baki Graduate University was one. It was a seminary with a business school in it. And I had no idea that those resources existed. I was like, when I
Mm,
found them, I thought they were made just for me. And so
mm,
I went really deep in diving into some of the work and those resources. I've got some on my desk, but that there was a lot of research and a lot of study, rigorous theological study around that. And so I was really grateful to God that I found it, because I feel like it gave me a lot of creative freedom.
right.
Because I think the other sense was that, well, I left the for-profit sector to go into the ministry. And if I was called to the ministry, then I can never leave the nonprofit
Mm,
sector, or it's like I'm somehow abandoning my calling. And it's like, that would be, again, another kind of false
Yes.
narrative.
So hold on right there because I want to talk about the idea of calling. There are times, right, that Moses gets a burning bush and God speaks. And if God does that, then you need to
You better
listen to what he
listen.
says.
You better do exactly what he
Right.
says.
So,
Right.
so let's take all of these kind of descriptive moments, not necessarily prescriptive for how it always happens, and let's set those over to the side. And let's just talk about kind of the normalcy of everyday walking with Christ. When the Bible talks about calling, there's really only a few ways it genuinely uses the word that we get translate from the Greek calling in the New Testament. God calls people to himself. So there's a salvific reality of calling.
Mm-hmm.
And then he calls his people to holiness. Paul writes to the church at
Mm-hmm.
Thessalonica, this is God's will for you that you abstain
Mm-hmm.
from sexual immorality. So when we talk about what God's called me to, he's called me to himself and he's called me to holiness, which then, outside of the burning bush, brings an entire spectrum of freedom for how I use my time. Most decisions are left and right, not right and wrong. And I really believe that.
Yep.
But I know that idea of calling is, you meet with almost any, it's a great question because people are saying, I want to be in line with God's will for my
Yes.
life. And
Yes.
I think a great response to that is God's given you so much more freedom in that, in calling him to yourself into holiness than you ever imagined.
Right. Yep.
I
A
mean, would you
thousand
affirm
percent. I
that?
think and I had a friend that when I was in the middle of this process and changing my mind 1,000 times about leaving and changing positions, he was like, I don't think this is an obedience issue. Like, I think if I don't think you're disobeying. Like, it's an opportunity. It's an open door. You can walk through it. You don't have to walk through it. You can be faithful and fruitful, whether you do or don't. And that's why in the last podcast, like the question I really was asking was not, is this what you're asking me to do? It was, can I become who you made me to be?
Hmm.
And I think that's is this a step in the direction of that holiness? Is this a step in the direction of that sanctification? Is this a step away from idols
Hmm.
or dependencies into more faithfulness? So yeah, I think there's a lot of unnecessary confusion and constriction when I make everything, especially in these work decisions of that, that it's an obedience issue or not.
I'd love your
And that,
thoughts on this. And I've had podcasts, our mutual friend Sandy Wilson basically tell me, yeah, I would not ever do that. And then I did it the next Sunday. So I'm happy to be disagreed with here. But then somebody gave me this grid. This is not original to me, but even in processing job opportunities or transitions we've made, to think of the idea of calling, outside of this kind of supernatural speaking, of a threefold grid of desire, opportunity, and affirmation. And that if, the basic questions of, do I actually desire to do this? Right?
mm-hmm,
Is this something that I get excited about?
mm-hmm,
Is there an opportunity to do what I desire? And then is there kind of a twofold affirmation? Do people that know me well affirm that seems like a great fit?
mm-hmm,
And then on the other side, the people hiring, are they affirming that they
mm-hmm.
actually want me, type of deal?
Yep.
And so that desire, opportunity, and affirmation, do you hear that and go, man, I'd throw that away? Or is there
No,
anything in there that you think is helpful?
yeah, I think it's super helpful. I think there's a natural, there's a way that we view the world and we do assessment work around this in our consulting, where we'll assess and be able to really validate how someone makes meaning. Every one of us are going to pursue making meaning in a particular way. So,
Okay.
so we may gravitate to different people and sectors and segments and roles and gifts and volunteering because they seem more meaningful to us than
Mm.
something else. So that's part of that desire. Am I compelled naturally and drawn toward that thing? And there are times scripturally where Paul's knocking on doors that God won't open, and then
Sure.
doors open that he wasn't knocking on. So
Yeah.
recognizing that God is going to direct our steps in particular ways, and I've seen a lot of people, bypass steps.
Mm.
I talk about stewarding opportunities. They'll say, well, this is the opportunity in front of me, but it's not the one I want. It's like,
Right.
well, you might have to walk through the open door in order
Mm.
to experience a different
Yeah.
door. You can't always bypass it or skip the steps. So I think there's value
Well,
in that framework. It's just never quite as formulaic. And I think another dynamic of recognizing that passion, which is close to desire, there's a willingness to be in pain or to struggle
Mm,
for something that matters more than pain. So
mm,
if it's something I really desire, then it's going to require work and risk. There's no good thing that doesn't, like the difference between a dream and a fantasy. A fantasy is a picture of the future that doesn't involve work and risk. A
okay.
dream, a Martin Luther King type dream, is there's a picture of the future and it's going to require a lot of work and risk.
Yeah, that's a
So
good distinction.
yeah, am I really willing to pour myself into it? Is another part of how I know I'm called to something is I embrace the tedious, mundane,
Hmm.
monotonous aspects of it. Um,
Well, and honestly, just on that line of thinking, I think for some, there's a picture of as if I can actually get this, this is what God's called me to do, and I'm going to discern it, and I'm going to find it, and I'm going to do it. Well, now I'm in this perfect center of God's will, and the pain and the difficulty and all that goes away because I find like I found the right
mhm,
thing.
mhm,
I, I just don't. You don't see that in the scripture anywhere. It's
yeah,
it's Abraham gets to the promised land and he finds a famine, and he was squarely in the middle of what God had
mhm,
called him to do. And so we can't punt these convictions simply because difficulty arises.
yeah, yeah. I was on one of my first mission trips to Madagascar. I remember having a
Madagascar was
vivid.
never the same after that.
I certainly wasn't. I don't know if I had as much impact on Madagascar as it had on me, but
Yeah.
the realization that God does not reward faithfulness the same way this side of heaven. So
Mm,
I could have all the appearance of success and that not be indicative of faithfulness, or I could have all the
absolutely.
appearance of failure and that not be indicative of faithlessness. Kim Wilson would always quote Mother Teresa when she was asked, "How do you know if you were successful?" And she said, "My dear son, I wasn't called to be successful. I was called to be faithful."
Mm,
So really recognizing that, and another illustration I'll steal from my talk to come in Downline, but Amy Sherman wrote a book called Kingdom Calling, and she basically says, you and I are like the little pink spoon at Baskin Robbins. The whole point of that sample at Baskin Robbins is, do I want more of this? Do I want
mm,
it? Do I want 2 scoops? Do I want it with Butterfinger sprinkles,
mm,
Oreos? Like, you and I are pink spoons. We're not the whole scoop. We're a small scoop. We're an important taste, but we're just a taste of what the kingdom might be. So our job is to be as faithful
mm,
of a taste of the kingdom where we are, wherever we are in all things. And it's like, okay, if I can do that faithfully for the years that I have, will that be enough? And I think a
mm.
lot of people say that they need more or bigger or better. So
Yeah,
it's a lot to
how do
reconcile.
you right? So where does contentment and discontentment come into play in all of this?
Mm-hmm.
Right? There's a I think there's a good Holy Spirit disruption that a lot of us
Yep.
feel that we
Yep.
may phrase as like something more, something else, something different.
Yeah.
And then there's a sinful discontentment of I just don't like this, so I'm not going to do it anymore.
Yeah. No, I love that question. The I think Jesus embodied passion. He embodied an anger for how things ought to be. So when you and I are sensitive to the Spirit and we see things that are not as they ought to be, and then we're willing to engage with those
Mm,
things, to participate with the kingdom, with the Spirit, to engage lovingly with those things, I think that is when we are really in step with. Now we start asking questions about, how did this happen? Why is this way? Versus that what we tend to do in our environment is villainize the Republicans, the Democrats, the men, the women. It's this group, it's that group. If they would have, they should have, they didn't, they don't. Versus like, okay, I see this thing. It's not okay.
mm,
What am I angry for? And that I think passion being the ultimate kind of gift of that recognition might lead me to obediently respond. It
mm,
might even lead me to sacrificially act,
mm,
maybe even lead me to set aside what I'm entitled to. And I do think I think that is probably the greatest antidote to complacency and apathy, is when I allow myself to be moved by things that I think God would be moved by.
And that
Um,
cost you something.
right. I think at the core of sacrifice is love. It's not sacrificial if it's not loving.
Hmm.
That I'm willing to diminish my authority to meet the vulnerability of somebody else. That's the territory of Christ likeness, I think. And unfortunately, it's more rare in my life than I want it to be. But I
But
do
not,
think
but your hair is kind of Christ-like.
I do tell people I think I've aged out of that role. Like I think I'm too old to. I think it's more of an Abrahamic, maybe Mosaic look.
I feel like you're a chosen understudy at this point.
They haven't called yet, so I don't know if they're going to watch this or not. But I think there's got to be a role for me in there somewhere else. This
I'll
is
get it
all
in
in
front of them.
vain.
We need VidAngel to edit out your shirtless comment from the previous episode. So,
Well, you brought it up again. Now we have to edit it out twice.
but no, I think that that's true. Is again not prescriptive for everyone, but I think God rarely calls us to great things that don't include a cost.
Right.
And Jesus is the biggest picture of that, right? There's no crown without the cross. The biggest temptation Satan offers him in the wilderness is, hey, here's the kingdom with no suffering. I mean, that was
Mm-hmm.
the
Right.
ultimate temptation, right? And that, to your point earlier, that's a fantasy. That's not a realistic dream.
Yeah. It's tempting, but it is a fantasy. And I think there's another monumental component to all of this that is the sense of community, of
Mm.
truly living out my calling in community, that it is not done in isolation. I just think there's such an there's and this is I'm not the first to say this, obviously, and this isn't revolutionary, but there's still such a spirit of individualism in the church that it's my ministry or my platform or my influence, and I think we just lose this overall sense. And I love this in I think it's in the high priestly prayer, when Christ in the shadow of the cross is basically saying, when one of us go, because of the unity of the Spirit that we have in the love of Christ, when one of us goes, we all go.
Mm.
Like when you're faithful, I get to participate in that faithfulness. When you're unfaithful, or when you don't go, when you
Yeah, it
don't
hurts all of
avail
us.
yourself, then it harms the body. And so
Yeah.
that's why Paul speaks against laziness, I think, is you're not loving when you're not participating with the body. And so I think we lose that sense of it. Unfortunately, it's that American Western influence that I think still infiltrates our corporate expression, is that it still can be. I don't know if you feel that. I don't know if you agree with that or if you experience
Yeah.
that, but that's
Yeah,
a
no,
sense of mine.
for sure. I think the only hard part with community is the word's been so overused it
You're
almost
right.
loses meaning. You know what I
Right.
mean? And so I think even drilling down to what is that, when you say community, what does that even mean?
Can
Right?
I
It's
take a
not
stab at
something,
that?
yeah, go for it.
Well, I love to break it down this way. It's common unity, right? So we're united by what we share in common,
Mm,
and I would distill that to our greatest common denominator is our deep neediness. So
mm,
if we get honest, like the ticket to admission, a mentor of mine would say that the ticket to admission to the church is the admittance that we are desperately needy, first and foremost, of someone more powerful than death in the person of Christ to conquer death on our behalf,
mm-hmm.
to give us his righteousness. And then that we get to, in light of that response to that neediness and receipt of that great gift, that we get to participate together. And I think what unfortunately is lost, and I don't have a solution for this other than one person at a time, of like, as long as we can come together and we don't have to pretend that we've outgrown that neediness, then
Sure.
we can experience deep intimacy with Christ and with each other. But I think that
Mm.
that sense of community is we're united by the needs we share in common. And I think in Acts, the early days of the first century church, of how they had everything in common. It said that they shared all things in common based on that great need. Yeah,
No,
lots.
that's good. That's helpful. Well, I think any sort of putting more skin on that just skeleton of community that's been
Mm,
so tossed out there, and just so many buzzwords that have lost their meaning.
I
So
know.
you adding that, I think, super helpful. All right, Shad, we're going to leave it there. Hey, if you want to hear more from Shad, and I hope you do, Downline Institute is for you. If you like this podcast, subscribe, give us a rating. Shad, thanks again. Great to see you as always.
Likewise. Thanks, Jamie. Love you.